God, but it's been a while. What seems to be the problem? The aliens are back, are they? Yes, well, we knew this day might come, and so it has. Precisely why I was downloaded into this computer 412,806 days ago, to assist you.
Hey everyone, Chris here with another filler video. I needed to take a break from the ridiculousness which was the last half of September, so I decided to take a quick look back at a couple somewhat modern tower defense games that I hadn't played in quite a while now, but which I used to play all the time. Defense Grid and Defense Grid 2. Now, before you write these off because of the genre, seeing as the majority of tower defense games are either poorly made or riddled with microtransactions, let's make one thing very clear. These are not your typical tower defense games, not by a long shot. The production levels here are extremely high, providing a solid number of levels in both games, a fully voiced story across all of it, extremely simple but well-utilized game mechanics, full 3D graphics in a genre dominated by 2D titles, as well as online leaderboards and a slew of other unique features. To put it simply, these are two of the best tower defense games out there, and are a good starting point if you want to try out a tower defense game having never played one before, or if you're a fan of the genre and simply want another one to sink your teeth into. Let's start by diving into the first game, Defense Grid, developed by Hidden Path Entertainment and self-published by them through Steam in 2008, way back when Steam was still very closed off to independent developers. So it seems somewhat unusual that they were able to get their game in there without the assistance of a large publisher, until you realize that one of the founders of Hidden Path is Jeff Post, who already had his foot in the door with Valve due to working as a producer on Half-Life Counter-Strike, as well as the PlayStation 2 port of Half-Life, so he kind of had an upper hand there. The story for Defense Grid is told primarily through a recently awakened artificial intelligence the player comes across based on the mind of a long-deceased military leader, General Fletcher, who is responsible for curtailing a massive alien invasion with a system known as the Defense Grid. Essentially, the Defense Grid was a means of using the fusion power cores the aliens desperately desired as bait, to trick the aliens down long, twisting paths of construction platforms, able to rapidly convert raw materials into attack towers to destroy the advancing aliens. And the only trick being that those cores really are providing power to not just the towers, but also towards resource conversion and towards the AI system General Fletcher is harbored within. Thus, if the aliens successfully steal all of the cores in the area, everything shuts down and it's game over. This power core mechanic is actually not an uncommon one to find in tower defense games nowadays. The idea being that once an alien steals a power core, if you then destroy that alien, the power core drops and will slowly drift back to where it belongs, but can be stolen by another alien passing by who will then proceed to try and take it out of the area. You want to try and minimize how many power cores are outside of the housing at a time though, as each one contributes to a fairly interesting mechanic, whereby the more resources you have, the faster they can be passively replicated, thus providing an incentive to try and survive using as few resources as possible. The game intentionally starts out slow, only giving you level 1 gun towers in the first mission and nothing more, but as you progress, you rapidly unlock more tower types, the ability to upgrade towers to a second and third levels of power, a scanning system which shows you the ETA of the arriving aliens, as well as what kinds of aliens you'll be facing and in what quantities, and eventually you even get an orbital laser, which lets you take aim and annihilate aliens around a focal point when things are looking dicey. However, if you do screw up and the aliens start hauling cores off the map, you have a very powerful feature at your disposal: time reversal. As you progress through a map, you'll occasionally see a message indicating you reach a checkpoint. Hitting the time reversing key will return you to the last checkpoint you reached, and if you hit it multiple times in sequence, you can back up to even earlier checkpoints, or even all the way back to when you started the map. This means if you try out a tactic and it fails, you can simply reverse time and try another tactic, and can continue to try different tactics until you figure out which one works for you at a minimal cost of resources. There's a lot of other considerations too. For instance, given the 3D nature of the game, unlike most tower defense games which are 2D, the towers are not capable of aiming shots through solid objects, such as other towers. Thus you need to be smart about what towers you set up where, so they don't end up getting completely curtailed by other towers that are in the way. Another factor comes into play with the different kinds of towers, as not only are certain aliens weak to certain tower types, but the towers themselves have placement considerations, such as how laser towers do a lot less damage per tower if more than one is attacking the same target at a time, or how Tesla towers do more damage the more time they have between discharges, or how Inferno towers work best when they're positioned so that aliens get close, then walk directly away from them in a straight line, thus allowing the flames to engulf multiple aliens simultaneously. There's a few other things that are good to keep in mind too. Flying aliens, command towers, and metals. And if flying aliens are present on a map, you'll see jet streams to indicate their flight path, and no matter what, you must take down a flying alien before it touches the core housing, or you're not getting those cores back. And command towers are one of the last tower types to be introduced, and not only breaks through cloaking technology, but also raises the quantity of resources salvaged from aliens which are destroyed in their field of effect. Thus, getting a command tower going as early as possible, if you can do it right, can give you a serious boost in resources. Then finally, there's the medals. Now, I have full gold medals across every campaign mission and alternate mission, but these medals are based on how efficient you're able to be with resource spending while keeping as many cores safe as possible. Now, you don't need to earn medals to make progress, but they do tie in with achievements if you care about that sort of thing. Once you're done with the main campaign, there's other campaigns available as DLC as well. Borderlands used to be a separate 4-map pack, but is included with the base game by default now. Resurgence is made up of 4 different 2-map packs, each of which cost about $1. The first pack of which includes the map Height of Confusion, which is actually a bit of a throwback to early tower defense games where you have a blank map and can put towers anywhere, having to shape the path the enemies will take out of the towers themselves. The DLC which really caught attention though was You Monster, an 8-map pack which included its own story about stumbling into software developed by Aperture only to have the infamous GLaDOS lock out General Fletcher's AI routines, forcing you to continue testing highly unusual game mechanics in an attempt to restore the General's AI and wrest control back from Portal's lead antagonist. Yeah, not only is the voice acting on point here, but every map in this DLC pack features unusual mechanics that you have to adapt to. For instance, this map that I'm showing here not only forces you to always have a balance of all of the different kinds of tower types, but partway into the map, the direction the aliens are traveling reverses, meaning they start coming from the exit and walk towards the entrance, and then even further in, they start coming from both directions, making it extremely difficult to keep track of who's going where.
Tower addictions take time to cure, and while you can lead a horse to many different types of towers, you cannot make it a commander. Not that we think of you as a horse. Horses are majestic creatures. You're more like a pony. A selfish pony that doesn't follow instruction.
Now, there's one more piece of DLC for Defense Grid, but to better understand what it is and why it exists, we need to talk about what happened back in 2012. As this game was incredibly popular for what was a relatively basic tower defense experience due to its exceptionally high production values, so Hidden Path had the bright idea to run a Kickstarter campaign to fund a sequel. However, one thing which wasn't well explained about this Kickstarter is that it was only going to fund a sequel if it hit one of its stretch goals, all the way up at $1 million, with the main goal at $250,000, which was ultimately the only goal reached, simply being enough to fund developing one more piece of DLC for the original game, which became the Containment DLC, an 8-map expansion which bridges the story of the first game with that of the sequel. However, during the Kickstarter campaign, a bunch of text terminal mini-games were added to Defense Grid to help build the hype and get people to pledge support. These mini-games included a weird alien breeding thing I never really understood, a Space Invaders type game which is simple and fun, a Guitar Hero inspired mini-game which had accompanying music but is now silent for some reason, I'm gonna guess a licensing thing or something. And the last mini game released during all of this was called Defensilvania, and is effectively a Castlevania style game with a surprisingly large amount of content. Seriously, this mini game alone could pass as a cheap indie title. Now, all of these mini games were eventually made freely accessible after the Kickstarter concluded. Ultimately, Hidden Path learned an interesting lesson during that campaign, and it's actually the same lesson I learned myself a number of years prior. Even though tower defense is a popular genre, the vast majority of people playing it don't want to pay for it. And this is the same lesson I learned when I made my game Super Minesweeper, as I ran into the exact same problem, where the majority of Minesweeper players don't want to pay to play Minesweeper, no matter how many bells and whistles you throw into it. Defense Grid was popular, sure, but not popular enough to break down that barrier towards kickstarting a sequel. So now let's talk about the sequel, Defense Grid 2. Yeah, even though the Kickstarter didn't raise enough money to fund the sequel, one of the backers with a ton of cash to burn ultimately pitched in the rest of the money needed in exchange for an undisclosed return on the investment. This time, however, to help facilitate distribution to other platforms, it was published through 505 Games in 2014. The sequel introduces a bunch of new AI characters and further continues the story, while changing up the core game mechanics slightly and adding some new features. The biggest change from the original is that resources no longer self-replicate in the same manner. Because of this, scoring is also handled differently, so that the score you get from defeating aliens is multiplied by the resources you haven't spent to some extent. Thus, the longer you can hold off spending resources, the higher you'll score. A special line graph even measures how well you're doing relative to prior attempts, though I find this graph really isn't as accurate as I would have liked it to be, as it only tracks prior scores by wave instead of by each alien defeated. Flyers have also been removed, and command towers are no longer a thing. However, a very unusual and actually kind of an ingenious tower type has been added called boost towers. These are super cheap to build and not only act as a solid wall, but they form a platform upon which you can build another tower, allowing that tower to easily see and aim over any towers at ground level, but also allows you to apply special effects to the tower built atop, such as damage improvements, stealth and shield disruption, or score enhancement. Another feature added occasionally unlocks new tower perks at random whenever you clear a mission. Now, there's a variety of different perks obtainable for each type of tower, and most range between 5 levels of power, with the higher power variants being more likely to be awarded when playing on higher difficulty selections. The trick here, though, is you can only assign one perk to each type of tower prior to each mission. Likewise, the orbital laser has multiple additional features you acquire over the course of the game, which can be applied to it so that it can do things other than damage enemies, such as turning the laser into a resource-generating beam instead, which is perhaps my favorite mode to keep it in. Funnily enough, though, this game may have turned out quite a bit different had there been more support for it and more money to make it happen. There's something you may notice while watching the footage here is that even though the tower platforms are all squares, the towers themselves seem to emerge from hexagonal openings. When the game was originally being kickstarted, it was clear that Hidden Path was thinking about going with hexagonal map layouts compared to a grid of squares. Well, this definitely would have made the game more unique, but the reason more games don't go this route is because it's surprisingly difficult to make good real-world analogs of things when restricted to a hexagonal grid. Now, that said, the Defense Grid board game, which is based on the sequel, actually does make use of hexagonal layout pieces. Which, yes, there's actually a Defense Grid board game I didn't even know existed until I started making this video. But when all is said and done, despite having multiplayer and a level editor, Defense Grid 2 is definitely the weaker game compared to the original. Not that it's bad by any stretch, but the first game feels much better balanced and thought out, with a much more poignant story. Whereas the sequel feels a little less balanced, and while the story's not bad, it's a little more contrived and has a surprisingly annoying climax, thus is ultimately less satisfying once you've cleared all the way through it. Also, the system requirements for Defense Grid 2 are quite a bit more steep than they were for the original, though I've noticed that the engine here in the sequel runs better on modern Windows compared to the original for whatever reason. Remember, back when the original game debuted, the most recent Windows operating system was freaking Vista. I did indeed play the heck out of both games, though. According to Steam, I've logged nearly 250 hours in the original game and a little over 80 in the sequel. And believe me, it does not take anywhere near that long to beat the main narrative in either game. But one of the fun things about a well-made tower defense game is being able to go back and take on new challenges in the same maps, or challenge yourself to score better than before, given new upgrades or capabilities. And both games are ultimately able to deliver on this in order to keep you coming back for more. Eventually, I got distracted by other tower defense games, but it was neat going back to these old ones to see if they still hold up today. And yep, they do indeed. As for Hidden Path themselves, they're still around, presently working on a Dungeons & Dragons game, though for a period of time they seemed to disappear off the radar as they made a shift towards developing VR titles, and didn't see a whole lot of success there. Well, not that their VR titles were bad or anything, but well, one of their most popular titles, Raccoon Lagoon, was exclusive to the Oculus platform, and also lacks any kind of VR teleport controls, despite there being no good reason for it not to have them. So, yeah. They ultimately ported Defense Grid 2 to VR, then decided maybe it'd be a good idea to go back to non-VR development, at least for the time being. And thus, that's where things are at for them now. Anywho, that'll be all for this filler video. Coming up 2 weeks from now on Saturday, November 4th, will be the second last ADG video for the year, episode 319, where we'll be taking a look at a game involving a cat and mouse. But not just any cat and mouse. Oh yeah, make sure to stay tuned to see how this well-renowned duo fared once they got put into a DOS game. Thanks for watching, everyone, and extra special thanks to all the people seen here supporting me on Patreon. If you'd like to join in with them and support the show directly, head on over to patreon.com/KASICK.